Peace and power to all the people, man. Happy Monday. This is not a day of regret. If you woke up, you winning. We just fresh off the clock, man. For all y'all who went to work today, hopefully y'all had a great day at y'all sponsors. Hopefully y'all made that money to feed these kids, you know what I'm saying? And you know what I mean? Don't fall into the hype. Don't fall into the rat race Monday, because Monday is known to be the most stressful day of the week because people hate returning to work. Hence, if you woke up, you're winning. And so in chapter 9, it's called Cyclic Phenomena. I'm very curious to see what amazing info she gonna get, what downloads gonna come through today. This chapter is an hour and 22 minutes long. So let's get straight to it. Grab your popcorn, get whatever you need, roll that thing, get your little cup. If you fresh off work, put this in the back, learn something. You know what I mean?
Chapter 9. Thou canst not call that madness, of which thou art proved to know nothing. Tertullian, Apology. This is not a matter of today or yesterday, but hath been from all times, and none hath told us whence it came or how. Sophocles. Belief in the supernatural is a fact natural, primitive, universal, and constant in the life and history of the human race. Unbelief in the supernatural begets materialism. Materialism, sensuality. Sensuality, social convulsions, amid whose storms man again learns to believe and pray. Guyot. If anyone think that these things incredible, let him keep his opinions to himself, and not contradict those who by such events are incited to study of virtue. Josephus. From the Platonic and Pythagorean views of matter and force, we will now turn to the Kabbalistic philosophy of the origin of man, and compare it with the theory of natural selection enunciated by Darwin and Wallace. It may be that we shall find as much reason to credit the ancients with originality in this direction, as in that which we have been considering. To our mind, no stronger proof of the theory of cyclical progression need be required than the comparative enlightenment of former ages and that of the patristic church, as regards the form of the earth and the movements of the planetary system. Even were other evidence wanting, the ignorance of Augustine and Lactantius, misleading the whole of Christendom upon these questions until the period of Galileo, would mark the eclipse through which human knowledge passes from age to age. The coats of skin mentioned in the 3rd chapter of Genesis as given to Adam and Eve are explained by certain ancient philosophers to mean the fleshy bodies with which, in the progress of cycles, the progenitors of the race became clothed. They maintained that the godlike physical form became grosser and grosser, until the bottom of what may be termed the last spiritual cycle was reached, and mankind entered upon the ascending arc of the first human cycle. Then began an uninterrupted series of cycles or yugas, the precise number of years of which each of them consisted remaining an inviolable mystery within the precincts of the sanctuaries, and disclosed only to the initiates. As soon as humanity entered upon a new one, the Stone Age, with which the preceding cycle had closed, began to gradually merge into the following and next higher age. With each successive age, or epoch, men grew more refined, until the acme of perfection possible in that particular cycle had been reached. Then the receding wave of time carried back with it the vestiges of human, social, and intellectual progress. Cycle succeeded cycle by imperceptible transitions. Highly civilized, flourishing nations waxed in power, attained the climax of development, waned and became extinct, and mankind, when the end of the lower cyclic arc was reached, was replunged into barbarism as at the start. Kingdoms have crumbled and nation succeeded nation from the beginning until our day, the races alternately mounting to the highest and descending to the lowest points of development. Draper observes that there is no reason to suppose that any one cycle applied to the whole human race. On the contrary, while man in one portion of the planet was in a condition of retrogression, in another he might be progressing in enlightenment and civilization. How analogous this theory is to the law of planetary motion, which causes the individual orbs to rotate on their axis. the several systems to move around the respective suns, and the whole stellar host to follow a common path around a common center. Life and death, light and darkness, day and night on the planet, as it turns about its axis and transverses the zodiacal circle representing the lesser and the greater cycles. Remember the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, as in heaven, so on earth. Mr. Alfred R. Wallace argues with sound logic that the development of man has been more marked in his mental organization than in his external form. Man, he conceives to differ from the animal by being able to undergo great changes of conditions and of his entire environment. Without very marked alterations in bodily form and structure, the changes of climate he meets with a corresponding alteration in his clothing, shelter, weapons, and implements of husbandry. His body may become less hairy, more erect, and of a different color and proportions. The head and face is immediately connected with the organ of the mind, and as being the medium, expressing the most refined motions of his nature, alone change with the development of his intellect. There was a time when he had not yet acquired that wonderfully developed brain, the organ of the mind, which now, even in his lowest examples, raises him far above the highest brutes, at a period when he had the form but hardly the nature of man, when he neither possessed human speech nor sympathetic and moral feelings. Further, Mr. Wallace says that man may have been, indeed, I believe must have been, once a homogeneous race. In man, the hairy covering of the body has almost entirely disappeared. Of the cavemen of Les Isis, Mr. Wallace remarks further, the great breadth of the face, the enormous development of the ascending ramus of the lower jaw, indicate enormous muscular power in the habits of a savage and brutal race. Such are the glimpses which anthropology affords us of men, either arrived at the bottom of a cycle or starting in a new one. Let us see how far they are corroborated by clairvoyant psychometry. Professor Denton submitted a fragment of fossilized bone to his wife's examination, without giving Mrs. Denton any hint as to what the article was. It immediately called up to her pictures of people and scenes which he thinks belonged to the Stone Age. She saw men closely resembling monkeys, with a body very hairy, and as if the natural hair answered the purpose of clothing. I question whether he can stand perfectly upright. His hip joints appear to be so formed, he cannot, she added. Occasionally I see part of the body of one of those beings that looks comparatively smooth. I can see the skin, which is lighter colored. I do not know whether he belongs to the same period. At a distance the face seems flat, the lower part of it is heavy. They have what I suppose would be called proganthous jaws. The frontal region of the head is low, and the lower portion of it is very prominent, forming a round ridge across the forehead, immediately above the eyebrows. Now I see a face that looks like that of a human being, though there is a monkey-like appearance about it. All these seem of that kind, having long arms and hairy bodies. Whether or not the men of science are willing to concede the correctness of the Hermetic theory of the physical evolution of man from higher and more spiritual natures, they themselves show us how the race has progressed from the lowest observed point to its present development. And as all nature seems to be made up of analogies, is it unreasonable to affirm that the same progressive development of individual forms has prevailed among the inhabitants of the unseen universe? If such marvelous effects have been caused by evolution upon our little insignificant planet, producing reasoning and intuitive men from some higher type of the ape family, why suppose that the boundless realms of space are inhabited only by disembodied angelic forms? Why not give place in that vast domain to the spiritual duplicates of these hairy, long-armed, and half-reasoning ancestors, their predecessors, and all the successors down to our time? Of course, the spiritual parts of such primeval members of the human family would be as uncouth and undeveloped as were their physical bodies. While they made no attempt to calculate the duration of the grand cycle, the Hermetic philosophers yet maintain that, according to the cyclic law, the living human race must inevitably and collectively return one day to that point of departure, where man was first clothed with coats of skin. Or, to express it more clearly, the human race must, in accordance with the law of evolution, be finally physically spiritualized. Unless Messrs. Darwin and Huxley are prepared to prove that the man of our century has attained, as a physical and moral animal, the acme of perfection, and evolution, having reached its apex, must stop all further progress with the modern genus Homo, we do not see how they can possibly confute such a logical deduction. In his lecture on the action of natural selection on man, Mr. Alfred R. Wallace concludes his demonstrations as to the development of the human races under that law of selection by saying that if his conclusions are just, it must inevitably follow that the higher, the more intellectual and moral, must displace the lower and more degraded races, and the power of natural selection still acting on this mental organization must ever lead to the more perfect adaptation of man's higher faculties, to the condition of the surrounding nature, and to the exigencies of the social state, while his external form will probably ever remain unchanged, except in the development of that perfect beauty, refined and ennobled by the highest intellectual faculties and sympathetic emotions. His mental constitution may continue to advance and improve, till the world is again inhabited by a single, nearly homogeneous race, no individual of which will be inferior to the noblest specimens of existing humanity. Sober scientific methods and cautiousness in hypothetical possibilities have evidently their share in this expression of the opinions of the great anthropologist. Still, what he says above clashes in no way with our Kabbalistic assertions. Allowed to ever-progressing nature, to the great law of the survival of the fittest, one step beyond Mr. Wallace's deductions, and we have in future the possibility, nay, the assurance of a race, which, like the Vrilya of Bulwer Lytton's coming race, will be but one remove from the primitive sons of God. It will be observed that this philosophy of cycles, which was allegorized by the Egyptian hierophants in the circle of necessity, explains at the same time the allegory of the fall of man. According to the Arabian descriptions, each of the 7 chambers of the pyramids, those grandest of all cosmic symbols, was known by the name of a planet. The peculiar architecture of the pyramids shows in itself the drift of the metaphysical thought of their builders. The apex is lost in the clear blue sky of the land of the pharaohs, and typifies the primordial point lost in the unseen universe, from whence started the first race of the spiritual prototypes of man. Each mummy, from the moment that it was embalmed, lost its physical individuality. In one sense, it symbolized the human race, placed in such a way as was best calculated to aid the exit of the soul. The latter had to pass through the 7 planetary chambers before it made its exit through the symbolic apex. Each chamber typified, at the same time, one of the 7 spheres, and one of the 7 higher types of physico-spiritual humanity, alleged to be above our own. Every 3,000 years, the soul, representative of its race, had to return to its primal point of departure, before it underwent another evolution into a more perfected spiritual and physical transformation. We must go deep indeed into the abstruse metaphysics of Oriental mysticism before we can fully realize the infinitude of the subjects that were embraced at one sweep by the majestic thought of its exponents. Starting as a pure and perfect spiritual being, the Adam of the 2nd chapter of Genesis, not satisfied with the position allotted to him by the Demiurgus, who is the eldest first begotten, the Adam Kadmon, Adam the 2nd, the man of dust, strives in his pride to become creator in his turn. Evolved out of the androgynous Kadmon, this Adam is himself an androgyne, for, according to the oldest beliefs presented allegorically in Plato's Timaeus, the prototypes of our races were all enclosed in the microcosmic tree which grew and developed within and under the great mundane or macrocosmic tree. Divine spirit being considered a unity, however numerous the rays of the great spiritual sun, man has still had his origin like all other forms, whether organic or otherwise, in this one fount of eternal light. Were we even to reject the hypothesis of an androgynous man in connection with physical evolution, the significance of the allegory in its spiritual sense would remain unimpaired. So long as the first God-man, symbolizing the 2 first principles of creation, the dual male and female element, had no thought of good and evil. He could not hypostasize woman, for she was in him as he was in her. It was only when, as a result of the evil hints of the serpent, matter, the latter, condensed itself and cooled on the spiritual man in its contact with the elements, that the fruits of the man tree, who is himself that tree of knowledge, appeared to his view. From this moment, the androgynal union ceased. Man evolved out of himself, the woman as a separate entity. They have broken the thread between pure spirit and pure matter. Henceforth, they create no more spiritually and by the sole power of their will. Man has become a physical creator, and the kingdom of spirit can be won only by a long imprisonment in matter. The meaning of Gogard, the Hellenic tree of life, the sacred oak among whose luxuriant branches a serpent dwells and cannot be dislodged, thus becomes apparent. Creeping out from the primordial Ilus, the mundane snake grows more material and waxes in strength and power with every new evolution. The Adam Primus, or Kadmon, the logos of the Jewish mystics, is the same as the Grecian Prometheus, who seeks to rival with the divine wisdom. He is also the Pymander of Hermes, or the power of the thought divine in its most spiritual aspect, for he was less hypostasized by the Egyptians than the two former. These all create men, but fail in their final object, desiring to endow man with an immortal spirit, in order that by linking the Trinity in one, he might gradually return to his primal spiritual state without losing his individuality. Prometheus fails in his attempt to steal the divine fire, and is sentenced to expiate his crime on Mount Kazbek. Prometheus is also the logos of the ancient Greeks, as well as Heracles. In the Codex Nazareus, we see Bahak-Zivo deserting the heaven of his father, confessing that though he is the father of the genie, he is unable to construct creatures, for he is equally unacquainted with Orcus as with the consuming fire which is wanting in light. And Fetahil, one of the powers, sits in the mud, matter, and wonders why the living fire is so changed. All of these logi strove to endow man with the immortal spirit, failed, and nearly all are represented as being punished for the attempt by severe sentences. Those of the early Christian fathers, who, like Origen and Clemens Alexandrinus, were well versed in pagan symbology, having begun their careers as philosophers, felt very much embarrassed. They could not deny the anticipation of their doctrines in the oldest myths. The latest logos, according to their teachings, had also appeared in order to show mankind the way to immortality. And in his desire to endow the world with eternal life, through the Pentecostal fire, had lost his life agreeably to the traditional program. Thus was originated the very awkward explanation of which our modern clergy freely avail themselves, that all these mythic types show the prophetic spirit which, through the Lord's mercy, was afforded even to the heathen idolaters. The pagans, they assert, had presented in their imagery the great drama of Calvary. Hence the resemblance. On the other hand, the philosophers maintained, with unassailable logic, that the pious fathers had simply helped themselves to a ready-made groundwork, either finding it easier than to exert their own imagination, or because of the greater number of ignorant proselytes who were attracted to the new doctrine by such an extraordinary resemblance with their mythologies, at least as far as the outward form of the most fundamental doctrine goes. The allegory of the fall of man and the fire of Prometheus is also another version of the myth of the rebellion of the proud Lucifer, hurled down to the bottomless pit, Orcus. In the religion of the Brahmins, Moishashur, the Hindu Lucifer, becomes envious of the Creator's resplendent light, and at the head of a legion of inferior spirits rebels against Brahma and declares war against him. Like Hercules, the faithful Titan, who helps Jupiter and restores to him his throne, Siva, the third person of the Hindu Trinity, hurls them all from the celestial abode in Handera, the region of eternal darkness. But here the fallen angels are made to repent of their evil deed, and in the Hindu doctrine they are all afforded the opportunity to progress. In the Greek fiction, Hercules, the sun god, descends to Hades to deliver the victims from their tortures. And the Christian Church also makes her incarnate God descend to the dreary Platonic regions and overcome the rebellious ex-archangel. In their turn, the Kabbalists explain the allegory in a semi-scientific way. Adam, the second, or the first created race, which Plato calls gods, and the Bible the Elohim, was not triple in his nature like the earthly man, i.e., he was not composed of soul, spirit, and body, but was a compound of sublimated astral elements into which the Father had breathed an immortal, divine spirit. The latter, by reason of its godlike essence, was ever struggling to liberate itself from the bonds of even that flimsy prison. Hence, the sons of God, in their imprudent efforts, were the first to trace a future model for the cyclic law. But man must not be like one of us, says the creative deity, one of the Elohim, entrusted with the fabrication of the lower animal. And thus it was, when the men of the first race had reached the summit of the first cycle, they lost their balance, and their second envelope, the grosser clothing, astral body, dragged them down the opposite arc. The Kabbalistic version of the sons of God, or of light, is given in the Codex Nazareus. Bahak, Zivo, the father of Genie, is ordered to construct creatures, but as he is ignorant of Orcus, he fails to do so, and calls in Fetahil, a still purer spirit, to his aid, who fails still worse. Then steps on the stage of creation the spirit, which properly ought to be translated soul, for it is the anima mundi, and which with the Nazarenes and the Gnostics was feminine. And perceiving that for Fetahil, the newest man, the latest, the splendor was changed, and that for splendor existed, the splendor was changed, and that for splendor existed, decrease and damage awakes Carabantos, who was frantic and without sense and judgment, and says to him, "Arise, see the splendor, light of the newest man, Fetahil, has failed to produce or create men. The decrease of this splendor is visible. Rise up, come with thy mother, the spiritus, and free thee from limits by which thou art held, and those more ample than the whole world." After which follows the union of the frantic and blind matter, guided by the insinuations of the spirit, not the divine breath, but the astral spirit, which by its double essence is already tainted with matter. And the offer of the mother being accepted, the spiritus conceives 7 figures, which Arrhenius is disposed to take for the 7 stellars, planets, but which represent the 7 capital sins, the progeny of an astral soul separated from its divine source, spirit and matter, the blind demon of concupiscence. Seeing this, Fetahil extends his hand toward the abyss of matter, and says, "Let the earth exist just as the abode of the powers had existed." Dipping his hand in the chaos, which he condenses, he creates our planet. Then the Codex proceeds to tell how Bahak Zivo was separated from the spiritus, and the genie or angels from the rebels. Then Mano, the greatest, who dwells with the greatest pharaoh, calls Keber Zivo, known also by the name of Nebat Ivar, Bar Eufin Ifafin, helm and vine of the food of life, he being the third life, and commiserating the rebellious and foolish genie, on account of the magnitude of their ambition, says, "Lord of the genie, aeons, see what the genie, the rebellious angels, do, and about what they are consulting. They say, let us call forth the world, and let us call the powers into existence. The genii are the principles, the sons of light, but thou art the messenger of life." And in order to counteract the influence of the 7 badly deposed principles, the progeny of spirits, Kabar Zio, the mighty lord of splendor, procreates 7 other lives, the cardinal virtues, who shine in their own form and light from on high, and thus reestablishes the balance between good and evil, light and darkness. But this creation of beings, without the requisite influx of divine pure breath in them, which was known among the Kabbalists as the living fire, produced but creatures of matter and astral light. Thus were generated the animals which preceded man on this earth. The spiritual beings, the sons of light, those who remained faithful to the great Pharaoh, the first cause of all, constitute the celestial or angelic hierarchy. the Adonim, and the legions of the never-embodied spiritual men, the followers of the rebellious and foolish genii, and the descendants of the witless 7 spirits begotten by Carabantos. And the spirits became in course of time the men of our planet, after having previously passed through every creation of every one of the elements. From this stage of life they had been traced by Darwin, who shows us how our highest forms have been evolved out of the lowest. Anthropology dares not follow the Kabbalist in his metaphysical flights beyond this planet, and it is doubtful if its teachers have the courage to search for the missing link in the old Kabbalistic manuscripts. Thus was set in motion the first cycle, which in its rotations downward brought an infinitesimal part of the creative lives to our planet of mud. Arrived at the lowest point of the arc of the cycle, which directly preceded life on this earth, the pure divine spark still lingering in the atom made an effort to separate itself from the astral spirit, for man was falling gradually into generation, and the fleshly coat was becoming with very action more and more dense. And now comes a mystery, a sod, a secret which Rabbi Simeon imparted but to very few initiates. It was enacted once every 7 years during the mysteries of Samothrace, and the records of it are found self-printed on the leaves of the Tibetan sacred tree, the mysterious Kunbum in the lamasery of the holy adepts. In the shoreless ocean of space radiates the central spiritual and invisible sun. The universe is his body, spirit, and soul, and after this ideal model are framed all things. These 3 emanations are the 3 lives, the 3 degrees of the Gnostic pleroma, the 3 Kabbalistic faces, for the ancient of the ancient, the holy of the aged, the great Ein Sof, has a form and then he has no form. The invisible assumed a form when he called the universe into existence, says the Sohar. The Book of Splendor, the first light is his soul, the infinite, boundless, and immortal breath, under the efflux of which the universe heaves its mighty bosom, infusing intelligent life throughout creation. The second emanation condenses cometary matter and produces forms within the cosmic circle, sets the countless worlds floating in the electric space, and infuses the unintelligent, blind life principle into every form. The third produces the whole universe of physical matter. And as it keeps gradually receding from the central divine light, its brightness wanes and it becomes darkness and the bad, pure matter, the gross purgations of the celestial fire. Of the Hermetists. When the central invisible, the Lord Pharaoh, saw the efforts of the divine scintilla, unwilling to be dragged lower down into the degradation of matter, to liberate itself, he permitted it to shoot out from itself a monad, over which, attached to it as if by the finest thread, the divine scintilla, the soul, had to watch during its ceaseless peregrinations from one form to another. Thus the monad was shot down into the first form of matter, and became encased in stone. Then, in course of time, through the combined efforts of living fire and living water, both of which shone their reflection upon the stone, the monad crept out of its prison, to sunlight as a lichen. From change to change it went higher and higher, the monad with every new transformation borrowing more of its radiance of its parent, scintilla, which approached it nearer at every transmigration. For the first cause had willed it to proceed in this order, and destined it to creep on higher until its physical form became one more the atom of dust, shaped in the image of the atom Cadmon. Before undergoing its last earthly transformation, the external covering of the monad, from the moment of its conception as an embryo, passes in turn once more through the phases of the several kingdoms. In its fluidic prison it assumes a vague resemblance at various periods of the gestation to plant, reptile, bird, and animal, and it becomes a human embryo. At the birth of the future man, the monad, radiating with all the glory of its immortal parent, which watches it from the 7th sphere, becomes senseless. It loses all recollection of the past and returns to consciousness, but gradually, when the instinct of childhood gives way to reason and intelligence. After the separation between the life principle, astral spirit, and the body takes place, the liberated soul, monad, exultingly rejoins the mother and father spirit. The radiant agoides and the two merged into one, forever form. with a glory proportioned to the spiritual purity of the past earth life, the Adam who has completed the circle of necessity and is freed from the last vestige of his physical encasement. Henceforth, growing more and more radiant at each step of his upward progress, he mounts the shining path that ends at the point from which he started round the grand cycle. The whole Darwinian theory of natural selection is included in the first 6 chapters of the book of Genesis. The man of chapter 1 is radically different from the Adam of chapter 2, for the former was created male and female, that is, bisexed, and in the image of God, while the latter, according to the verse 7, was formed out of the dust of the ground and became a living soul, after the Lord God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Moreover, this Adam was a male being, and in the verse 20 we are told that there was not found a helpmeet for him. The Adonai, being pure spiritual entities, had no sex, or rather had both sexes united in themselves, like their Creator. And the ancients understood this so well that they represented many of their deities as of dual sex. The biblical student must either accept this interpretation or make the passages in the 2 chapters alluded to absurdly contradict each other. It was such literal acceptance of passages that warranted the atheist in covering the Mosaic account with ridicule, and it is the dead letter of the old text that begets the materialism of our age. Not only are these 2 races of beings thus clearly indicated in Genesis, but even a third and a fourth one are ushered before the reader in chapter 4, where the sons of God and the race of giants are spoken of. As we write, there appears in an American paper, the Kansas City Times, an account of important discoveries of the remains of a prehistoric race of giants, which corroborates the statements of the Kabbalist and the Bible allegories at the same time. It is worth preserving. In his researches among the forests of western Missouri, Judge E.P. West has discovered a number of conical-shaped mounds, similar in construction to those found in Ohio and Kentucky. These mounds are found upon the high bluffs overlooking the Missouri River, the largest and more prominent being found in Tennessee, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Until about 3 weeks ago, it was not suspected that the mound builders had made this region their home in the prehistoric days. But now it is discovered that this strange and extinct race once occupied this land, and have left an extensive graveyard and a number of high mounds upon the Clay County bluffs. As yet, only one of these mounds has been opened. Judge West discovered a skeleton about 2 weeks ago and made a report to other members of the society. They accompanied him to the mound, and not far from the surface excavated and took out the remains of 2 skeletons. The bones are very large, so large, in fact, when compared with an ordinary skeleton of modern date, they appear to have formed part of a giant. The head bones, such as have not rotted away, are monstrous in size. The lower jaw of one skeleton is in a state of preservation, and is double the size of the jaw of a civilized person. The teeth in this jawbone are large and appear to have been ground down and worn away by contact with roots and carnivorous food. The jawbone indicates immense muscular strength. The thigh bone, when compared with that of an ordinary modern skeleton, looks like that of a horse. The length, thickness, and muscular development are remarkable. But the most peculiar part about the skeleton is the frontal bone. It is very low and differs radically from any ever seen in this section before. It forms one thick ridge of bone about 1 inch wide extending across the eyes. It is a narrow but rather heavy ridge of bone, which instead of extending upward, as does now in these days of civilization, receded back from the eyebrows, forming a flat head, and thus indicates a very low order of mankind. It is the opinion of the scientific gentlemen who are making these discoveries that these bones are the remains of a prehistoric race of men. They do not resemble the present existing race of Indians, nor are the mounds constructed upon any pattern or model known to have been in use by any race of men now in existence in America. The bodies are discovered in a sitting posture in the mounds, and among the bones are found stone weapons such as flint knives, flint scrapers, and all of them different in shape to the arrowheads, the war hatchets, and other stone tools and weapons known to have been in use by the aboriginal Indians of this land when discovered by the whites. The gentlemen who have these curious bones in charge have deposited them with Dr. Foe on Main Street, It is their intention to make further and closer researches in the mounds on the bluffs opposite this city. They will make a report on their labors at the next meeting of the Academy of Science, by which time they expect to be able to make some definite reports as to their opinions. It's pretty definitely settled, however, that the skeletons are those of a race of men not now in existence. The author of a recent and very elaborate work finds some causes for merriment over the union of the sons of God with the daughters of men, who were fair, as alluded to in Genesis, and described at great length in that wonderful legend, the Book of Enoch. More is the pity that our most learned and liberal men do not employ their close and merciless logic to repair its one-sidedness by seeking the true spirit, which dictated these allegories of old. The spirit was certainly more scientific than skeptics are yet prepared to admit. But with every year some new discovery may corroborate their assertions, until the whole of antiquity is vindicated. One thing at least has been shown in the Hebrew text, viz., that there was one race of purely physical creatures, another purely spiritual. The evolution and transformation of species required to fill the gap between the two has been left to abler anthropologists. We can only repeat the philosophy of men of old, which says that the union of these two races produced a third, the Adamite race. Sharing the natures of both its parents, it is equally adapted to an existence in the material and spiritual worlds. Allied to the physical half of man's nature is reason, which enables him to maintain his supremacy over the lower animals, and to subjugate nature to its uses. Allied to his spiritual part and his conscience, which will serve as his unerring guide to the besentment of the senses. For conscience is that instantaneous perception between right and wrong, which can only be exercised by the spirit, which, being a portion of the divine wisdom and purity, is absolutely pure and wise. Its promptings are independent of reason, and it can only manifest itself clearly when unhampered by the baser attractions of our dual nature. Reason being a faculty of our physical brain, one which is justly defined as that of deducing inferences from premises, and being wholly dependent on the evidence of other senses, cannot be a quality pertaining directly to our divine spirit. The latter knows, hence, all reasoning which implies discussion and argument would be useless. So an entity which, if it must be considered as a direct emanation from the eternal spirit of wisdom, has to be viewed as possessed of the same attributes as the essence or the whole of which it is part. Therefore, it is with a certain degree of logic that the ancient theurgists maintained that the rational part of man's soul, spirit, never entered wholly into man's body, but only overshadowed him, more or less through the irrational or astral soul, which serves as an intermediatory agent, or a medium between spirit and body. The man who has conquered matter sufficiently to receive the direct light from his shining agodies feels truth intuitionally. He could not err in his judgment, notwithstanding all the sophisms suggested by cold reason, for he is illuminated. Hence prophecy, vaticination, and the so-called divine inspiration are simply the effects of this illumination from above by our own immortal spirit. Swedenborg, following the mystical doctrines of the Hermetic philosophers, devoted a number of volumes to the elucidation of the internal sense of Genesis. Swedenborg was undoubtedly a natural-born magician, a seer, and he was not an adept. Thus, however closely he may have followed the apparent method of interpretation used by the alchemists and mystic writers, he partially failed. The more so that the model chosen by him in this method was one who, albeit a great alchemist, was no more of an adept than the Swedish seer himself, in the fullest sense of the word. Eugenius Philalethes had never attained the highest pyrotechny, to use the diction of the mystic philosophers. But although both have missed the whole truth in its details, Swedenborg has virtually given the same interpretation of the first chapter of Genesis as the Hermetic philosophers. The seer, as well as the initiates, notwithstanding their veiled phraseology, clearly show that the first chapters of Genesis relate to the regeneration or a new birth of man, not to the creation of our universe and its crown work, man. The fact that the terms of the alchemists, such as salt, sulfur, and mercury, are transformed by Swedenborg into ends, cause, and effect, does not affect the underlying idea of solving the problems of the Mosaic books by the only possible method, that used by the Hermetists, that of correspondences. His doctrine of correspondence, or Hermetic symbolism, is that of Pythagoras and of the Kabbalists, as above, so below. It is also that of the Buddhist philosophers, who, in their still more abstract metaphysics, inverting the usual mode of definition given by our erudite scholars, call the invisible types the only reality, and everything else the effects of the causes, or visible prototypes, illusions. However contradictory their various elucidations of the Pentateuch may appear on their surface, every one of them tends to show that the sacred literature of every country, the Bible as much as the Vedas or the Buddhist scriptures, can only be understood and thoroughly sifted by the light of Hermetic philosophy. The great sages of antiquity, those of the medieval ages, and the mystical writers of our modern times also, were all Hermetists. Whether the light of truth had illumined them through their faculty of intuition, or as a consequence of study and regular initiation, virtually they had accepted the method and followed the path traced to them by such men as Moses, Gautama Buddha, and Jesus. The truth, symbolized by some alchemists as dew from heaven, had descended into their hearts, and they had all gathered it upon the tops of mountains, after having spread clean linen cloths to receive it, and thus in one sense they had secured, each for himself and his own way, the universal solvent. How much they were allowed to share it with the public is another question. That veil which is alleged to have covered the face of Moses, when, after descending from Sinai, he taught his people the word of God, cannot be withdrawn at the will of the teacher only. It depends upon the listeners, whether they will also remain the veil which is upon their hearts. Paul says it plainly, and his words addressed to the Corinthians can be applied to every man or woman.
So, y'all, we at the 40-minute mark. Have y'all caught any downloads yet? What has stuck out to y'all? As you can see, I got unbelief in the supernatural leads to materialism, aka leads to hell and reincarnation on this realm. As above, so below. Gots to know that. You feel me? That's why astrology is so important. People be trying to shit on astrology and zodiacal signs and I don't believe in. All right, gonna forever stay fucked up. Gots to know yourself. And then I also got Moses, Buddha, and Jesus were all hermeticists and or magicians. That's what I got so far on my end. Y'all let me know what y'all got in the comments.
And of any age in the history of the world. If their minds are blinded by the shining skin of divine truth, whether the hermetic veil be withdrawn or not from the face of the teacher, it cannot be taken away from their heart unless it shall turn to the Lord. But the latter appellation must not be applied to either of the three anthropomorphized personages of the Trinity, but to the Lord, as understood by Swedenborg and the Hermetic philosophers, the Lord who is life and man. The everlasting conflict between the world religions, Christianity, Judaism, Brahmanism, paganism, Buddhism, proceeds from this one source. Truth is known but to the few. The rest, unwilling to withdraw the veil from their own hearts, imagine it blinding the eyes of their neighbor. The God of every exotic religion, including Christianity, notwithstanding its pretensions to mystery, is an idol, a fiction, and cannot be anything else. Moses, closely veiled, speaks to the cliff-necked multitudes of Jehovah, the cruel anthropomorphic deity, as of the highest God, burying deep in the bottom of his heart that truth which cannot be either spoken of or revealed. Kapila cuts with the sharp sword of his sarcasms the Brahmin yogins, who in their mystical visions pretend to see the highest one. Gautama Buddha conceals, under an impenetrable cloak of metaphysical subtleties, the verity, and is regarded by posterity as an atheist. Pythagoras, with his allegorical mysticism and metempsychosis, is held for a clever impostor, and is succeeded in the same estimation by other philosophers like Apollonius and Plotinus, who are generally spoken of as visionaries if not charlatans. Plato, whose writings were never read by the majority of our great scholars but superficially, is accused by many of his translators of absurdities and puerilities, and even of being ignorant of his own language, most likely for saying, in reference to the Supreme, that a matter of that kind cannot be expressed by words, like other things to be learned, and making Protagoras lay too much stress on the use of veils. We could fill a whole volume with names of misunderstood sages, whose writings, only because our materialistic critics feel unable to lift the veil, which shrouds them, pass off in a current way for mystical absurdities. The most important feature of this seemingly incomprehensible mystery lies perhaps in the inevitable habit of the majority of readers to judge a work by its words and insufficiently expressed ideas, leaving the spirit of it out of the question. Philosophers of quite different schools may often be found to use a multitude of different expressions, some dark and metaphorical, all figurative and yet treating of the same subject, like the 1,000 divergent rays of a globe of fire. Every ray leads, nevertheless, to the central point. So every mystic philosopher, whether he be a devoutly pious enthusiast like Henry Moore, an irascible alchemist using a Billingsgate phraseology like his adversary, Eugenius Philalethes, or an atheist like Spinoza, all had one and the same object in view, man. It is Spinoza, however, who furnishes perhaps the truest key to a portion of this unwritten secret. While Moses forbids graven images of him whose name is not to be taken in vain, Spinoza goes farther. He clearly infers that God must not be so much as described. Human language is totally unfit to give an idea of this being who is altogether unique. Whether it is Spinoza or the Christian theology that is more right in their premises and conclusion, we leave the reader to judge for himself. Every attempt to the contrary leads a nation to anthropomorphize the deity in whom it believes, and the result is that given by Swedenborg. Instead of stating that God made man after his own image, we ought in truth to say that man imagines God after his image, forgetting that he has set up his own reflection for worship. Where then lies the true, real secret so much talked about by the Hermetists? That there was and there is a secret, no candid student of esoteric literature will ever doubt. Men of genius, as many of the Hermetic philosophers undeniably were, would not have made fools of themselves by trying to fool others for several thousand consecutive years. That this great secret, commonly termed the Philosopher's Stone, had a spiritual as well as a physical meaning attached to it, was suspected in all ages. The author of Remarks on Alchemy and the Alchemists very truly observes that the subject of the Hermetic art is man, and the object of the art is the perfection of man. But we cannot agree with him that only those whom he terms money-loving sots ever attempted to carry a purely moral design of the alchemists into the field of physical science. The fact alone that man, in their eyes, is a trinity, which they divide into Sol, water of mercury, and sulfur, which is the secret fire, or, to speak plain, into body, soul, and spirit, shows that there is a physical side to the question. Man is the philosopher's stone spiritually, a triune or trinity in unity, as Philalethes expresses it. But he is also that stone physically. The latter is but the effect of the cause, and the cause is the universal solvent of everything, divine spirit. Man is a correlation of chemical physical forces, as well as a correlation of spiritual powers. The latter react on the physical powers of man in proportion to the development of the earthly man. The work is carried to perfection according to the virtue of a body, soul, and spirit, says an alchemist. For the body would never be penetrable were it not for the spirit, nor would the spirit be permanent in its supra-perfect tincture were it not for the body. Nor could these two act one upon another without the soul, for the spirit is an invisible thing, nor doth it ever appear without another garment, which garment is the soul. The philosophers by fire asserted through their chief, Robert Flood, that sympathy is the offspring of light, and antipathy hath its beginning from darkness. Moreover, they taught with other Kabbalists that contrarieties in nature both proceed from one eternal essence, or from the root of all things. Thus, the first cause is the parent source of good as well as of evil. The Creator, who is not the highest God, is the father of matter, which is bad, as well as of spirit, which, emanating from the highest invisible cause, passes through him like through a vehicle, then pervades the whole universe. It is most certain, remarks Robertus de Fluctibus, Robert Flood, that as there are an infinity of visible creatures, so there is an endless variety of invisible ones, of diverse natures in the universal machine. Through the mysterious name of God, which Moses was so desirous of him, Jehovah, to hear and know, when he received from him this answer, Jehovah is my everlasting name. As for the other name, it is so pure and simple that it cannot be articulated, or compounded, or truly expressed by man's voice. All the other names are wholly comprehended within it, for it contains the property as well as nullity as volunty, of privation as position, of death as life, of cursing as blessing, of evil as good, though nothing ideally is bad in him, of hatred and discord, and consequently of sympathy and antipathy. Lowest in the scale of being are those invisible creatures called by the Kabbalists the elementary. There are three distinct classes of these. The highest, in intelligence and cunning, are the so-called terrestrial spirits, of which we will speak more categorically in other parts of this work. Suffice to say, for the present, they are the larvae, or shadows of those who lived on earth, have refused all spiritual light, remained and died deeply immersed in the mire of matter. And from those sinful souls the immortal spirit has gradually separated. The second class is composed of the invisible antitypes to the men to be born. No form can come into objective existence, from the highest to the lowest, before the abstract ideal of this form, or, as Aristotle would call it, the privation of this form, is called forth. Before an artist paints a picture, every feature of it exists already in his imagination. To have enabled us to discern a watch, this particular watch must have existed in its abstract form in the watchmaker's mind. So with future men. According to Aristotle's doctrine, there are three principles of natural bodies: privation, matter, and form. These principles may be applied in this particular case. The privation of the child, which is to be, we will locate in the universal mind of the great architect of the universe. The privation of the child which is to be, we will locate in the invisible mind of the great architect of the universe. Privation not being considered in the Aristotelic philosophy as a principle in the composition of bodies, but as an external property in their production. For the production is a change by which the matter passes from the shape it has, not to that which it assumes. Though the privation of the unborn child's form, as well as the future form of the unmade watch, is that which is neither substance nor extension nor quality as yet, nor any kind of existence, it is still something which is, though it outlines, in order to be, must acquire an objective form. The abstract must become concrete, in short. Thus, as soon as this privation of matter is transmitted by energy to universal ether, it becomes a material form, however sublimated. If modern science teaches that human thought affects the matter of another universe simultaneously with this, how can he who believes in an intelligent first cause deny that the divine thought is equally transmitted, by the same law of energy, to our common mediator, the universal ether, the world soul? And if so, then it must follow that once there, the divine thought manifests itself objectively, energy faithfully reproducing the outlines of that whose privation was first born in the divine mind. Only it must not be understood that this thought creates matter. No, it creates but the design for the future form, the matter which serves to make this design having always been in existence, and having been prepared to form a human body, through a series of progressive transformations, as the result of evolution. Forms pass, ideas that created them and the material which gave them the objectiveness remain. These models, as yet devoid of immortal spirits, are elementals, properly speaking, psychic embryos. which when their time arrives die out of the invisible world and are born into this visible one as human infants, receiving in transitu that divine breath called spirit which completes the perfect man. This class cannot communicate objectively with men. The third class are the elementals proper, which never evolve into human beings but occupy, as it were, a specific step of the ladder of being, and by comparison with the others, may properly be called nature spirits or cosmic agents of nature, each being confined to its own element and never transgressing the bounds of others. These are what Tertullian called the princes of the powers of the air. This class is believed to possess but one of the three attributes of man. They have neither immortal spirits nor tangible bodies, only astral forms, which partake, in a distinguishing degree, They have neither immortal spirits nor tangible bodies, only astral forms, which partake in a distinguishing degree of the element to which they belong and also of the ether. They are a combination of sublimated matter and a rudimental mind. Some are changeless, but still have no separate individuality, acting collectively, so to say. Others, of certain elements and species, change form under a fixed law which Kabbalists explain. The most solid of their bodies is ordinarily just immaterial enough to escape perception by our physical eyesight, but not so unsubstantial, but that they can be perfectly organized by the inner or clairvoyant vision. They not only exist and can all live in ether, but can handle and direct it for the production of physical effects, as readily as we can compress air or water for the same purpose by pneumatic and hydraulic apparatus, in which occupation they are readily helped by the human elementary. More than this, they can so condense it as to make to themselves tangible bodies, which by their protean powers they can cause to assume such likeness as they choose, by taking as their models the portraits they find stamped in the memory of the persons present. It is not necessary that the sitter should be thinking at the moment of the one represented. His image may have faded many years before. The mind receives indelible impression even from chance acquaintance or persons encountered but once, as a few seconds' exposure of the sensitized photograph plate is all that is requisite to preserve indefinitely the image of the sitter. So it is with the mind. According to the doctrine of Proclus, the uppermost regions from the zenith of the universe to the moon belong to the gods or planetary spirits, according to their hierarchies and classes. The highest among them were the 12 upper Uranonoi, or supercelestial gods, having whole legions of subordinate demons at their command. They are followed next in rank and power by the Agosmai, the intercosmic gods, each of these presiding over a great number of demons, to whom they impart their power and change it from one to another at will. These are evidently the personified forces of nature in their mutual correlation, the latter being represented by the third class or the elementals we have just described. Further on he shows, on the principle of the Hermetic axiom of types and prototypes, that the lower spheres have their subdivisions and classes of beings as well as the upper celestial ones, the former being always subordinate to the higher ones. He held that the four elements are filled with demons, maintaining with Aristotle that the universe is full and that there is no void in nature. The demons of the earth, air, fire, and water are of an elastic, ethereal, semi-corporeal essence. It is these classes which officiate as intermediate agents between the gods and men. Although lower in intelligence than the sixth order of the higher demons, these beings preside directly over the elements and organic life. They direct the growth, the inflorescence, the properties, and various changes of plants. They are the personified ideas of virtues shed from the heavenly Yule into the inorganic matter. And as the vegetable kingdom is one remove higher than the mineral, these emanations from the celestial gods take form and being in the plant. They become its soul. It is that which Aristotle's doctrine terms the form in the three principles of natural bodies, classified by him as privation, matter, and form. His philosophy teaches that besides the original matter, another principle is necessary to complete the triune nature of every particle, and this is form, an invisible but still in an ontological sense of the word, a substantial being, really distinct from matter proper. Thus, in an animal or a plant, besides the bones, the flesh, the nerves, the brains, and the blood, in the former, and besides the pulpy matter, tissues, fibers, and juice in the latter, which blood and juice, by circulating through the veins and fibers, nourishes all parts of both animal and plant, and besides the animal spirits, which are the principles of motion, and the chemical energy which is transformed into vital force in the green leaf. There must be a substantial form, which Aristotle called in the horse's soul, Proclus the demon of every mineral, plant, or animal, and the medieval philosophers the elementary spirits of the four kingdoms. All this is held in our century as metaphysics and gross superstition. Still, on strictly ontological principles, there is in these old hypotheses some shadow of probability, some clue to the perplexing missing links of exact science. The latter has become so dogmatical of late that all that lies beyond the ken of inductive science is termed imaginary, and we find Professor Joseph Leconte stating that some of the best scientists ridicule the use of the term vital force or vitality as a remnant of superstition. De Candolle suggests the term vital movement instead of vital force, thus preparing for a final scientific leap which will transform the immortal, thinking man into an automaton with a clockwork inside him. But, objects Leconte, can we conceive of movement without force? And if the movement is peculiar, so also is the form of force. In the Jewish Kabbalah, the nature spirits were known under the general name of Shadim and divided into four classes. The Persians called them all devs, the Greeks indistinctly designated them as demons, the Egyptians knew them as Afritis, the ancient Mexicans, says Kaiser, believed in numerous spirit abodes, into one of which the shades of innocent children were placed until final disposal. Into another, situated in the sun, ascended the valiant souls of heroes, while the hideous specters of incorrigible sinners were sentenced to wander in despair in subterranean caves, held in the bonds of the earth atmosphere, unwilling and unable to liberate themselves. They passed their time in communicating with mortals and frightening those who could see them. Some of the African tribes know them as Yawahoos. In the Indian pantheon, there are no less than 330 million of various kinds of spirits, including elementals, which the latter were termed by the Brahmins the Dityas. These beings are known by the adepts to be attracted towards certain quarters of the heavens by something of the same mysterious property which makes the magnetic needle turn toward the north, and certain plants to obey the same attraction. The various races are also believed to have special sympathy with certain human temperaments, and to more readily exert power over such than others. Thus, a bilious, lymphatic, nervous, and sanguine person would be affected favorably or otherwise by conditions of the astral light, resulting from the different aspects of the planetary bodies. Having reached this general principle, after recorded observations extending over an indefinite series of years or ages, the adept astrologer would require only to know what the planetary aspects were at a given anterior date, and to apply his knowledge of the succeeding changes in the heavenly bodies, to be able to trace with approximate accuracy the varying fortunes of the personage whose horoscope was required, and even to predict the future. The accuracy of the horoscope would depend, of course, no less upon the astrologer's knowledge of the occult forces and races of nature than upon his astronomical erudition. Eliphas Levi expounds with reasonable clearness in his Dogme et Rituel de la Haute Magie the law of reciprocal influences between the planets and their combined effect on the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms, as well as upon ourselves. He states that the astral atmosphere is as constantly changing from day to day and from hour to hour as the air we breathe. He quotes approvingly the doctrine of Paracelsus that every man, animal, and plant bears external and internal evidences of the influences dominant at the moment of germinal development. He repeats the old Kabbalistic doctrine that nothing is unimportant in nature, and that even so small a thing as the birth of one child upon our insignificant planet has its effect upon the universe, as the whole universe has its own reactive influence upon him. The stars, he remarks, are linked to each other by attractions which hold them in equilibrium and cause them to move with regularity through space. This network of light stretches from all the spheres to all the spheres, and there is not a point upon any planet to which it has not attracted one of these indestructible threads. The precise locality, as well as the hour of birth, should then be calculated by the true adept in astrology. Then, when he shall have made the exact calculation of the astral influences, it remains for him to count the chances of his position in life, the helps or hindrances he is likely to encounter, and his natural impulses toward the accomplishment of his destiny. He also asserts that the individual force of the person, as indicating his ability to conquer difficulties and subdue unfavorable propensities, and so carve out his fortune, or to passively await what blind fate may bring, must be taken into account. A consideration of the subject from the standpoint of the ancients affords us, it will be seen, a very different view from that taken by Professor Tyndall in his famous Belfast address. To supersensual beings, says he, which, however potent and invisible, were nothing but species of human creatures, perhaps raised from among mankind, and retaining all human passions and appetites, were handed over the rule and governance of natural phenomena. To enforce his point, Mr. Tyndall conveniently quotes from Euripides, the familiar passage in Hume. The gods toss all into confusion, mix everything with its reverse, that all of us, from our ignorance and uncertainty, may pay them the more worship and reverence. Although enunciating in Chrysippus several Pythagorean doctrines, Euripides is considered by every ancient writer as heterodox. Therefore, the quotation proceeding from this philosopher does not at all strengthen Mr. Tyndall's argument. As to the human spirit, the notions of the older philosophers and medieval Kabbalists, while differing in some particulars, agreed on the whole, so the doctrine of one may be viewed as the doctrine of the other. The most substantial difference consisting in the location of the immortal or divine spirit of man. While the ancient Neoplatonists held that the Ogyges never descends hypostatically into the living man, but only sheds more or less its radiance on the inner man, the astral soul. The Kabbalists of the Middle Ages maintained that the spirit, detaching itself from the ocean of light and spirit, entered into man's soul, where it remained throughout life imprisoned in the astral capsule. This difference was the result of the belief of the Christian Kabbalists, more or less in the dead letter of the allegory of the fall of man. The soul, they said, became, through the fall of Adam, contaminated with the world of matter, or Satan. Before it could appear with its enclosed divine spirit in the presence of the eternal, it had to purify itself of the impurities of darkness. They compared the spirit imprisoned within the soul to a drop of water enclosed within a capsule of gelatin and thrown into the ocean. So long as the capsule remained whole, the drop of water remains isolated. Break the envelope and the drop becomes a part of the ocean.
All right, everybody. We got 16 minutes left in this chapter, chapter 9, cyclic phenomena. So we had a few more downloads come in. Truth is known but to the few, as many are not ready to, unfortunately, remove that veil from their eyes, man. People just ain't ready, which is why a lot of people be sounding crazy, and which is why a lot of people be getting gaslit, right? And this is a big one because for all the anime watchers out there, what the fuck is Ed's name? Well, I know his name is Ed, but what's his brother name from Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, the Elric brothers, the Philosopher's Stone? Man is the Philosopher's Stone, since we are an accumulation of everything in the universe. We're the precipice of creation here on the realm. You feel me? But yeah, let's go ahead and finish the thing off. Let me know what downloads or what stood out to y'all so far in the comments.
Its individual existence has ceased. So it is with the spirit. As long as it is enclosed in its plastic mediator, or soul, it has an individual existence. Destroy the capsule, a result which may occur from the agonies of withered conscience, crime, and moral disease, and the spirit returns back to its original abode. Its individuality is gone. On the other hand, the philosophers who explained the fall into generation, in their own way, viewed spirit as something wholly distinct from the soul. They allowed its presence in the astral capsule only so far as the spiritual emanations or rays from the Shining One were concerned. Man and soul had to conquer their immortality by ascending toward the unity with which, if successful, they were finally linked, and into which they were absorbed, so to say. The individualization of man after death depended on the spirit, not on his soul and body. Although the word personality, in the sense in which it is usually understood, is an absurdity, if applied literally to our immortal essence, still the latter is a distinct entity, immortal and eternal per se, and as is in the case of criminals beyond redemption, when the shining thread which links the spirit to the soul, from the moment of the birth of a child, is violently snapped, and the disembodied entity is left to share the fate of the lower animals, to gradually dissolve into ether, and have its individuality annihilated. Even then the spirit remains a distinct being. It becomes a planetary spirit, an angel, for the gods of the pagan or the archangels of the Christian, the direct emanations of the first cause, notwithstanding the hazardous statement of Swedenborg, never were or will be men, on our planet at least. This specialization has been in all ages the stumbling block of metaphysicians. The whole esoteric of the Buddhistic philosophy is based on the mysterious teaching, understood by so few persons and so totally misrepresented by many of the most learned scholars. Even metaphysicians are too inclined to confound the effect with the cause. A person may have won his immortal life and remain the same inner self as was on earth, throughout all eternity. But this does not imply necessarily that he must either remain Mr. Smith or Brown he was on earth, or lose his individuality. Therefore, the astral soul and terrestrial body of man may, in the dark hereafter, be absorbed into the cosmical ocean of sublimated elements, and cease to feel his ego, if this ego did not deserve to soar higher, and the divine spirit still remain an unchanged entity. Though this terrestrial experience of his emanations may be totally obliterated at the instant of separation from the unworthy vehicle. If the spirit, or the divine portion of the soul, is pre-existent as a distinct being from all eternity, as Origen, Synesius, and other Christian fathers and philosophers taught, and if it is the same and nothing more than the metaphysical objective soul, how can it be otherwise than eternal? And what matters it in such a case, whether man leads an animal or a pure life? If we do what he may, he can never lose his individuality. This doctrine is as pernicious in its consequences as that of a vicarious atonement. Had the latter dogma, in company with the false idea that we were all immortal, been demonstrated to the world in its true light, humanity would have been bettered by its propagation. Crime and sin would be avoided, not for fear of earthly punishment, or of a ridiculous hell, but for the sake of that which lies the most deeply rooted in our inner nature. The desire of an individual and distinct life in the hereafter, the positive assurance that we cannot win it unless we take the kingdom of heaven by violence, and the conviction that neither human prayers nor the blood of another man will save us from individual destruction after death, unless we firmly link ourselves during our terrestrial life with our immortal spirit, our God. Pythagoras, Plato, Timaeus of Locris, and the whole Alexandrian school derived the soul from the universal world soul, and the latter was, according to their own teachings, ether, something of such a fine nature as to be perceived only by our inner sight. Therefore it cannot be the essence of the monas, or cause, because the anima mundi is but the effect, the objective emanation of the former. Both the human spirit and the soul are pre-existent. But while the former exists as a distinct entity, an individualization, the soul exists as pre-existing matter, an unscient portion of an intelligent whole. Both were originally formed from the eternal ocean of light. But as the Theosophists expressed it, there is a visible as well as invisible spirit in fire. They made a difference between the anima bruta and the anima divina, Empedocles firmly believed all men and animals to possess two souls, and in Aristotle we find that he calls one the reasoning soul, and the other the animal soul. According to those philosophers, the reasoning soul comes from without the universal soul, and the other from within. This divine and superior region, in which they located the invisible and supreme deity, was considered by them, by Aristotle himself, as a fifth element, purely spiritual and divine, whereas the anima mundi proper was considered as composed of a fine igneous and ethereal nature spread throughout the universe, in short, ether. The Stoics, the great materialists of our ancient days, accepted the invisible God and divine soul, spirit, from any such a corporeal nature. Their modern commentators and admirers, greedily seizing the opportunity, built on this ground the supposition that the Stoics believed in neither God nor soul. But Epicurus, whose doctrine militating directly against the agency of a supreme being and gods in the formation or government of the world, placed him far above the Stoics in atheism and materialism, taught nevertheless that the soul is of a fine, tender essence, formed from the smoothest, roundest, and finest atoms, which description still brings us to the same sublimated ether. Arnobius, Tertullian, Irenaeus, and Origen, notwithstanding their Christianity, believed with the more modern Spinoza and Hobbes that the soul was corporeal, though a very fine nature. This doctrine of the possibility of losing one's soul and hence individuality militates with the ideal theories and progressive ideas of some spiritualists, though Swedenborg fully adopts it. They will never accept the Kabbalistic doctrine which teaches that it is only through observing the law of harmony that the individual life hereafter can be obtained, and that the farther the inner and outer man deviate from this fount of harmony, whose source lies in our divine spirit, the more difficult it is to regain the ground. But while the spiritualists and other adherents of Christianity have little, if any, perception of this fact, the possible death and obliteration of the human personality by the separation of the immortal part from the perishable, the Swedenborgians fully comprehend it. One of the most respected ministers of the New York Church, the Reverend Chauncey Gills, D.D. of New York, recently elucidated the subject in a public discourse as follows. Physical death, or the death of the body, was a provision of the divine economy for the benefit of man, a provision by means of which he attained the higher ends of his being. But there is another death, which is the interruption of the divine order and the destruction of every human element in man's nature, and every possibility of human happiness. This is the spiritual death, which takes place before the dissolution of the body. There may be a vast development of man's natural mind without that development being accompanied by a particle of love of God, or of unselfish love of man. When one falls into a love of self and love of the world, with its pleasures, losing the divine love of God and of the neighbor, he falls from life to death. The higher principles which constitute the essential elements of his humanity perish, and he lives only on the natural plane of his faculties. Physically he exists, spiritually he is dead. To all that pertain to the higher and the only enduring phase of existence, he is as much dead as his body becomes dead to all the activities, delights, and sensations of the world when the spirit has left it. The spiritual death results from disobedience of the laws of spiritual life, which is followed by the same penalty as the disobedience of the laws of the natural life. But the spiritually dead have still their delights. They have their intellectual endowments and power and intense activities. All the animal delights are theirs, and to multitudes of men and women these constitute the highest ideal of human happiness. The tireless pursuit of riches, of the amusements and entertainments of social life, the cultivation of graces of manner, of taste in dress, of social preferment, of scientific distinction, intoxicate and enrapture these dead alive. But the eloquent preacher remarks, these creatures, with all their graces, rich attire, and brilliant accomplishments, are dead in the eye of the Lord and the angels, and when measured by the only true and immutable standard, have no more genuine life than skeletons whose flesh has turned to dust. A high development of the intellectual faculties does not imply spiritual and true life. Many of our greatest scientists are but animated corpses. They have no spiritual sight because their spirits have left them. So we might go through all ages, examine all occupations, weigh all human attainments, and investigate all forms of society, and we would find these spiritually dead everywhere. Pythagoras taught that the entire universe is one vast system of mathematically correct combinations. Plato shows the deity geometrizing. The world is sustained by the same law of equilibrium and harmony upon which it was built. The centripetal force could not manifest itself with the centrifugal in the harmonious revolutions of the spheres. All forms are the product of this dual force in nature. Thus, to illustrate our cause, we may designate the spirit as the centrifugal and the soul as the centripetal, spiritual energies. When in perfect harmony, both forces produce one result. Break or damage the centripetal motion of the earthly soul tending toward the center which attracts it, arrest its progress by clogging it with a heavier weight of matter than it can bear, and the harmony of the whole, which was its life, is destroyed. Individual life can only be continued if sustained by this twofold force. The last deviation from harmony damages it. When it is destroyed beyond redemption, the forces separate and the form is gradually annihilated. After the death of the depraved and the wicked arrives the critical moment. If during life the ultimate and desperate effort of the inner self to reunite itself with the faintly glimmering ray of its divine parent is neglected, if this ray is allowed to be more and more shut out by the thickening crust of matter, the soul, once freed from the body, follows its earthly attractions and is magnetically drawn into and held within the dense fogs of the material atmosphere. Then it begins to sink lower and lower until it finds itself, when returned to consciousness, in what the ancients termed Hades. The annihilation of such a soul is never instantaneous. It may last centuries, perhaps, for nature never proceeds by jumps and starts, and the astral soul being formed of elements, the law of evolution must bide its time. Then begins the fearful law of compensation, the yin-yaon of the Buddhists. This class of spirits are called the terrestrial or earthly elementary, in contradistinction to the other classes, as we have shown in the introductory chapter. In the East, they are known as the brothers of the shadow, cunning, low, vindictive, and seeking to retaliate their sufferings upon humanity. They become, until final annihilation, vampires, ghouls, and prominent actors. They are the leading stars on the great spiritual stage of materialization, which phenomena they perform with the help of the more intelligent of the genuine-born elemental creatures, which hover round and welcome them with delight in their own spheres. Henry Kuhnrath, the great German Kabbalist, has on a plate on his rare work, Amphitheatri Sapientiae Aeternae, representations of the four classes of these human elementary spirits. Once past the threshold of the sanctuary of initiation, once that an adept has lifted the veil of Isis, the mysterious and jealous goddess, he has nothing to fear. But till then he is in constant danger. Although Aristotle himself, anticipating the modern physiologists, regarded the human mind as a material substance, and ridiculed the hylozoists, nevertheless he fully believed in the existence of a double soul, or spirit and soul. He laughed at Strabo for believing that any particles of matter, per se, could have life and intellect in themselves sufficiently to fashion by degrees such a multiform world as ours. Aristotle is indebted for the sublime morality of his Nicomachean Ethics to a thorough study of the Pythagorean ethical fragments, for the latter can be easily shown to have been the source at which he gathered his ideas, though he might not have sworn by him who the Tetractys found. Finally, what do we know so certain about Aristotle? His philosophy is so abstruse that he constantly leaves his reader to supply by the imagination the missing links of his logical deductions. Moreover, we know that before his works ever reached our scholars, who delight in his seemingly atheistical arguments in support of his doctrine of fate, these works passed through too many hands to have remained immaculate. From Theophrastus, his legator, they passed to Neleus, whose heir kept them mouldering in subterranean caves for nearly 150 years. After which we learned that his manuscripts were copied and much augmented by Apollyon of Theos, who supplied such paragraphs as had become illegible by conjectures of his own, probably many of these drawn from the depths of his inner consciousness. Our scholars of the 19th century might certainly profit well by Aristotle's example. Were they as anxious to imitate him practically as they are to throw his inductive method and materialistic theories at the head of the Platonists? We invite them to collect facts as carefully as he did, instead of denying those they know nothing about. What we have said in the introductory chapter and elsewhere of mediums and the tendency of their mediumship is not based upon conjecture, but upon actual experience and observation. There is scarcely one phase of mediumship of either kind that we have not seen exemplified during the past 25 years in various countries: India, Tibet, Borneo, Siam, Egypt, Asia Minor, America, North and South, and other parts of the world have each displayed to us its peculiar phase of mediumistic phenomena and magical power. Our varied experience has taught us two important truths, viz., that for the exercise of the latter personal purity and the exercise of a trained and indomitable willpower are indispensable, and that spiritualists can never assure themselves of the genuineness of mediumistic manifestations unless they occur in the light and under such reasonable test conditions as would make an attempted fraud instantly noticed.
All right, gods and goddesses. That was chapter 9, cyclic phenomena. Let me know what downloads, what y'all thought was interesting in the comments. Like, share, comment, subscribe. Peace and power.